Bhagavad Gita verse 1, chapter 1. Dhritarashtra said. In Kurukshetra, the field of the Kurus and also the field of righteousness, both my sons and Pandu's sons gathered, eager to fight. What did they do? So begins the first chapter of the Gita. The first chapter is a dialogue between Dhritarashtra, father of the Kauravas, and Sanjaya, his charioteer and also his advisor. Sanjaya was given divine vision so that he could provide a real-time commentary on the Mahabharata war for the sightless Dhritarashtra. This verse begins to reveal one of the recurring themes of the Gita, the downside of extreme attachment to objects or situations. Dhritarashtra means someone who clings to his kingdom, and Sanjaya means victory. Dhritarashtra was extremely attached to his sons and his kingdom, which is one of the reasons that the Mahabharata war occurred. He refers to his nephews as Pandu's sons, indicating that they are a third party, whereas his sons are referred to as my sons. What exactly is attachment? Here's an example. Let's say Mr. X brought a brand new car. He shows it to all his friends, they ooh and they ah, his spouse is happy, his kids are jumping up and down and so on. When he hears all the praises, there usually is something inside him that puffs up. That thing is the ego. Now let's say a few weeks have passed. It's morning, and as he opens the car door, he notices a large dent on the side of the car. He begins to experience anger, sadness, and a whole host of other emotions. What just happened? It was attachment to the car. Mr. X's ego created an identification with the new car. In other words, it began to think of the car as an extension of its identity. So any praise for the car became the ego's praise, and any harm to the car became the ego's harm. The ego strengthens itself by attachment, i.e. identification with objects, thoughts, I am smart, I am sincere, etc., positions, e.g. right wing versus left wing. So what is the practical lesson here? Later chapters and verses will go in detail into this subject, but till then, this verse urges us to examine our life and take stock of our attachments. What are our attachments? How strong are those attachments? What can we do to prevent ourselves getting entangled in more and more attachments? Also, at this point, do we think that all attachments are bad? Or are some good? Upon introspection we will find the answers. The Gita will begin to address those questions as we go further into it. Bhagavad Gita verse 2, chapter 1. Sanjaya said. Observing that the Pandava army was organized into a military formation, Duryodhana approached his teacher Drona and spoke these words. Let's look at the character that is introduced in this verse, Duryodhana. Duryodhana was the son of Dhritarashtra, and leader of the Kaurava army in the Mahabharata war. He was a skilled and strong warrior, almost equal in prowess to Bhima, the strongest warrior in the Pandava army. Since childhood, Duryodhana grew up with the idea that he was the rightful heir to the throne and not Yudhishthira, who was the eldest brother of the Pandavas. Going back to the theme of the previous verse, which is that of attachment, he was extremely attached to the throne. But because he perceived the Pandavas as an obstacle to the throne, which was something that he was extremely attached to, he developed an aversion towards them. Think of aversion, or in other words, hatred, as the polar opposite of attachment. But interestingly enough, it is born out of attachment itself. For example, we saw that Mr. X from the last post was extremely attached to his car, and saw that someone had made a large dent in it. What feeling do you think Mr. X had for the person who caused that dent? That is aversion. Aversion is usually caused when we perceive a person, situation or object as an obstacle between us and the object of our attachment. And aversion, just like attachment, strengthens the ego. Examples are people, I hate my boss; objects, I hate my old TV; positions, I hate anyone who believes in communism; or situations, I hate my job. Now, why did Duryodhana approach his teacher Drona? He saw the military formation of the Pandavas and began to get scared. As is the case, most people run to someone superior when they get scared, so he approached his teacher for counsel. Drona was a teacher to both the Pandavas and Kauravas, and had equal affinity to both of them. And unlike some of the other senior warriors, Drona was not a blood relation to the Kauravas. Duryodhana also sensed that he needs to check in with Drona to understand his state of mind, because he needed Drona's prowess to win this war. There is an interesting leadership lesson here. If you are leading a team, in a business, political or any context, your success is not guaranteed unless everyone buys into a common vision that you as a leader have articulated. Bhagavad Gita verse 3, chapter 1. Teacher, behold this mighty Pandava army, that your intelligent student Drishtadyumna, son of Drupada, has organized in a military formation for battle. The Gita has many conversations within conversations, so it is useful to keep track. In the first two verses, Sanjaya and Dhritarashtra were talking, and in this verse, Duryodhana is addressing his teacher Drona. Here we begin to explore another theme of the Gita, which is that of mental equanimity, or as sometimes it is referred to, even keelness. We are at our best when our mind, the part of our brain that feels emotions, is calm and not agitated. When our mind is calm, it enables our intellect, the part of our brain that evaluates options and makes rational decisions, to give us the most logical way out of a situation. In the TV show Star Trek, Mr. Spock was always consulted to provide the best decision because he would never take emotions into considerations when making a decision. In the last verse we saw that Duryodhana wanted to ensure that Drona was sufficiently motivated to fight against his students the Pandavas, lest he become weak due to having a soft spot for them. So Duryodhana attempted to disturb Drona's equanimity by reminding him that the leader of the military formation that is in front of them is the son of Drupada. Drupada and Drona had a checkered past. They were the best of friends, but due to some misunderstandings, they turned into sworn enemies. By reminding Drona that Drupada's son Drishtadyumna is leading the opposing army, Duryodhana wanted to stir up Drona's emotions so that he think that his students purposely put Drishtadyumna in front, just to spite Drona. Do we have such biases or filters in our lives through which we view people or situations? How were they formed? Did some Duryodhana plant them in us? Uncovering such biases makes our decision-making clearer and simpler. Bhagavad Gita verse 4-6, chapter 1. This army has mighty archers such as Duryodhana, King Virata and Drupada who are equal to Bhima and Arjuna in battle. Other powerful warriors include Drishtaketu, Chekatana, the gallant king of Kashi, Purujit, Kantabhoja, Duryodhana, Adamaja, Abhimanyu and all the sons of Drupadi. Duryodhana continued his attempt to incite Drona to fight aggressively against the opposing army by calling out the mighty warriors on the other side. He chose each name carefully to elicit a reaction from Drona, since each of these warriors had a history with Drona. Duryodhana was Arjuna's top student, and Duryodhana wanted to point out that although Arjuna's top student was fighting on his teacher's side, Drona's top student Arjuna was fighting against his teacher. Drupada also was someone that Drona disliked, as was pointed out earlier. Drishtaketu's father had been killed by Krishna, yet he was on the side of the Pandavas. Chekatana was the only Yadava warrior not taking the side of the Kauravas. The king of Kashi was an exceptionally gallant warrior, and took the side of the Pandavas. Udamenyu and Adamaja were exceptional warriors from the Panchala kingdom. Purujit and Kantabhoja were Kunti's maternal brothers who were also related to the Kauravas, but chose the side of the Pandavas. Shibhya was Yudhishthira's father-in-law, similarly related to the Kauravas. Abhimanyu, Arjuna's son, was well versed in the art of breaking military formations. Duryodhana disliked Drupadi immensely, so her sons were pointed out as well. We begin to see how interrelated the warring parties were. Some were friends who turned into enemies, some were relatives who chose sides, and some like Drona were equally loving to both sides, but had to choose one based on their duty to the throne and the kingdom. It is a reminder that nothing in our lives stays the same. A relationship that gives you a lot of joy today, could in a matter of seconds turn into a sorrowful relationship at some point. Bhagavad Gita verse 7, chapter 1. O twice-born Drona, now I would like to bring to your attention to our competent warriors. Let me point you to some of my army's commanders. Duryodhana continued his conversation with Drona in this verse. As is apparent from the text of the verse, he wanted to now talk to Drona about his army, having assessed the capabilities of the Pandava army. Notice how each verse gives an indication of Duryodhana's state of mind. Initially, he saw the well-formed army of the Pandavas that was marching with a single vision, and began to worry that it may prove to be a formidable opponent. His worry prompted him to instigate Drona. Now in this verse Duryodhana's worry unleashed a condescending, mean attitude by calling Drona a twice-born. Twiceborn usually refers to individuals in the Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaishya classes. However, in this verse, this was a veiled insult, because although Drona was an accomplished warrior, he was a Brahmin by birth. Duryodhana wanted to imply that Drona, being a Brahmin, would be soft on his disciples, the Pandavas. In addition, use of the phrase my army also indicates that Duryodhana's ego was puffed up at this point. Bhagavad Gita verse 8, chapter 1. We have victorious warriors such as yourself, Bhishma, Kripacharya and Karna on our side. Similarly, we also have Ashvatthama, Vikarna, and Bhurishrava. Having conducted an assessment of the warriors on the Pandava side, Duryodhana began to conduct a similar assessment of his side. Throughout the last few verses we were observing Duryodhana's emotional state. After having lobbed an insult at Drona, and not having heard a response back, Duryodhana now became scared that he had angered his army's main commander and his teacher. So he wanted to say something to appease Drona. Hence he began his assessment of powerful warriors by putting Drona first in this verse. What does this tell us about Duryodhana's personality? Sometimes we tend to view people as either good or evil, and by that logic Duryodhana would be considered evil. But this temporary outpouring of reverence for his teacher shows that Duryodhana had some good qualities in him, although in lower proportion to his bad qualities. Later the Gita will provide a detailed explanation of types of qualities that all individuals have. At this point, let us consider that all individuals have a mix of three qualities or tendencies: a tendency that draws us towards inertia, another that draws us to action, and another that draws us to equanimity or harmony. Usually, one or two tendencies tend to dominate the other in us. You may know some people who have a tendency to be lazy and sleep all the time. Or there may be someone who cannot rest and has to keep doing something or the other. Or, there are some who do what's needed to run their lives and are not lazy, and also deal with severe setbacks and challenges while managing to stay calm, collected and even keel. What do we think is our most dominant tendency? Are there external factors that change it temporarily? For example, if you find that your most dominant tendency is towards action, are there factors that make you stable and peaceful? Bhagavad Gita verse 9, chapter 1. In addition to our commanders, we also have several other brave warriors who have vowed to give up their life for me. These warriors are well versed in deploying weapons, and are proficient in the art of battle. Duryodhana naively tried to impress Drona by glorifying his army. In doing so, his ego resurfaced again, which is evidenced by his self-aggrandizing statements like, "They will give up their life for me." He probably was trying to convince, or delude, himself that his army is poised to win the battle. The tendency of the ego to consider something mine is called mamta in Sanskrit. Mamta literally means mind-making or mindness. This is yet another means for the ego to strengthen itself through possessions. Here's an interesting exercise. Take something that you know for sure is yours. Now deeply examine it. Is it really yours? For example, say you own a house. On what basis do you consider it yours? Most probably, it's a legal document that the government issues to you. Well, what happens if that government no longer exists? Or, more likely, what happens if the government grabs that land from you because it possesses some precious natural resources? Is the relationship between you and the house real? Bhagavad Gita verse 10, chapter 1. Whereas our army, defended by Bhishma's strength, is infinitely capable of victory, the Pandava army defended by Bhima's strength seems limited. Duryodhana continued to boast about his army in this final comment to Drona. Note that Drona did not reply to any of Duryodhana's statements at any point in the conversation. His silence indicated either anger, disappointment or knowing the inevitable that his army was doomed to failure. If you measure Duryodhana's comments, they tend to become increasingly arrogant and hyperbolic throughout the conversation. Anytime you have somebody making hyperbolic statements praising themselves, it usually indicates an underlying insecurity. Bhagavad Gita verse 11, chapter 1. All of you should completely protect Bhishma at all points, situated in each of your various formations. Duryodhana instructed his main warriors to ensure Bhishma's safety since the Mahabharata war was about to begin. Let's do a quick recap. The first chapter opened with Dhritarashtra asking Sanjaya to elaborate on the progress of the war, and that led to Duryodhana's monologue to Drona. After the statement Duryodhana makes in the current verse, he no longer has a speaking part in the Gita anywhere. After this verse, we will encounter a series of verses that get us closer to the start of the battle, and closer to the core of the Gita. Bhagavad Gita verse 12, chapter 1. Then the valiant Bhishma, elder of the Kuru dynasty, blew his conch loudly, a sound as mighty as the roar of a lion, delighting Duryodhana. This is the first verse in a series of verses which indicate the beginning of the Mahabharata war. Traditionally, conches were blown to announce the start of the war. Bhishma, sensing the fear in Duryodhana, blew his conch so that Duryodhana felt confident that his army was still on his side. It also indicates the dependence of Duryodhana's ego on external circumstances, such as the roar of conches, in order to strengthen itself, instead of an innate belief that his army was on his side. Bhagavad Gita verse 13, chapter 1. Immediately thereafter, several conches, bugles, trumpets, kettle horns and cow horns resounded simultaneously, growing into a tumultuous sound. This is another verse in the sequence of verses that brings us closer to the start of the war. It also suggests that the Kaurava army was happy that their commander Bhishma was eager to begin the war. As we progress through this verse into some of the later verses, we cannot help but paint a picture of that battlefield, since the words used in these verses are so evocative. For some of us that grew up in India, we probably tend to dig up memories of watching the Mahabharata on Sunday morning, and maybe those memories are recalled. With this verse, we now have another dimension that adds depth to the picture, that of sound. The author of these verses clearly intends to paint a rich picture of the battlefield, and the Kaurava army in particular. We shall see why shortly. Bhagavad Gita verse 14, chapter 1. And then, seated on a magnificent chariot harnessed to white horses, Sri Krishna and Arjuna blew their divine conches. With this verse, we are introduced to the key figures in the Bhagavad Gita, as we leave behind Duryodhana and the Kaurava army. Lord Krishna was a divine incarnation or an avatar, and Arjuna was one of the 5 Pandava princes. Arjuna was considered the most skillful archer and warrior of his time. Sri Krishna was a close friend of Arjuna, and offered to be his charioteer for the Mahabharata war. The prior verses serve to paint a picture of the Kaurava army that was ready to engage in conflict with the Pandavas. As we move further into the text, the perspective shifts from Duryodhana's viewpoint to Arjuna's. Bhagavad Gita verse 15-18, chapter 1. Hrishikesha blew his conch named Panchajanya, Arjuna blew his conch Devdatta, and the fearsome Bhima blew his mighty conch named Pandra. King Yudhishthira, son of Kuntu, blew his conch named Anantavijayam, Nakula and Sadeva blew their conches named Sagosha and Manaprashpaka. The king of Kashi, a supreme archer, the mighty warriors Shikandi, Drishtadyumna, King Bharata and Satyaki. King Drupada, the sons of Drupadi and Abhimanyu, the mighty armed son of Subhadra, all blew their respective conches, O king. Blowing of the conches was a tradition that signified the start of a war. In other words, once that sound was heard, there was no room for compromise, there was no more vacillation on whether or not to fight, everyone was committed to start the war. We should remind ourselves again and again that the Gita is first and foremost a practical text on how to lead a balanced life, a life that is in harmony with the world. Therefore, we should try to connect what we read in this text to our own life and experiences. Arjuna was face to face with the Kaurava army, and the sound of the conches indicated that he was about to deal with an extremely difficult situation, that of war. Most of us also have to deal with extremely difficult situations every day, though usually not that of life or death, but ones with high stakes nevertheless. If you are a student, then a tough exam is an example. If you have a job, then an upcoming meeting with your boss is another example. When I read the blowing of the conches, I recalled a sound from my childhood which for me had similar implications. Early in the morning, at the same time every day, I would hear the sound of an air raid warning alarm, coming in from the distance. There was no imminent threat of an air raid, that sound was used only to test the warning system. But for me personally, it reminded me that in a few minutes I would have to face the most difficult situation a shy, nerdy kid has to face every day, school. Bhagavad Gita verse 19, chapter 1. That tumultuous sound resounded through the earth and the sky, shattering the hearts of the sons of Dhritarashtra. During college years my classmates and I used to participate in inter-college music competitions. Teams from various colleges competed with each other for the best music team prize. Usually the teams would all be waiting backstage to be called on to perform, but in the interim they would do mini rehearsals where they would sing 1 or 2 lines of their song to warm up. What was interesting is that most teams knew who would win just by hearing that 2-line sample of the song, because it provided a glimpse of that team's talent and preparation. Similarly, when the Pandavas blew their conchas, their sound was much louder and spirited than the Kauravas, even though the Pandava army was a fraction of the Kaurava army. That sound provided a window into the Pandava army's determination and preparation, which had the effect of injecting fear into the hearts of the Kauravas. Bhagavad Gita verse 20, chapter 1. Now, as he was about to take up arms against the battle-ready sons of Dhritarashtra, Arjuna, whose chariot displayed the emblem of an ape, spoke these words to Rishikesha, "O king. Did you observe something different here?" By now if you have attempted to read aloud any of the shlokas, you realize that they usually follow the same pattern, 2 lines per shloka, 2 quarters per line, 8 syllables per quarter. But in this shloka, we see for the first time that there are 3 lines instead of 2. This pattern or meter is changed every so often to indicate that the listener should pay close attention to a particular shloka, or the shlokas that follow. Let's also look at another aspect that this shloka highlights. The core of the Gita is a dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna. In ancient Indian literature, there exists a tradition of beginning important teachings or messages with the word atha, which means now. The shlokas so far covered introduction and background, but now, Arjuna starts the dialogue in the next verse, hence the word atha is used here. Bhagavad Gita verse 21-22, chapter 1. Arjuna said, "O infallible one, in preparation for combat, position my chariot between the 2 armies till I have surveyed those battle-hungry warriors with whom I have to fight." And so begins the conversation between Arjuna and Sri Krishna. At this point, Arjuna was firmly in control of the situation, and like any determined warrior, he commanded his charioteer to carry out his instructions. Similar to the analysis of Duryodhana's emotional state from the previous verses, let us analyze Arjuna's state. Here, it is clear that he was charged up for war, his warrior instincts had kicked into high gear, and he was bursting with self-confidence. Another point to consider here is how much, like Arjuna, we rely on our sense organs to deliver the right information to our brains so that we can take the right decision and carry out the necessary action that a situation demands. Our sense organs comprise our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. Any information that we process must necessarily come from one of these organs. Arjuna was located at some distance from the opposing army, so he knew that he needed to get a better look at the opposing army, and therefore have all the information he needs to make his battle plans. Sense organs and understanding how they function is a topic that will be discussed at great length in the rest of the Gita. Bhagavad Gita verse 23, chapter 1. Let me see those battle-hungry warriors, those who wish to adore that evil-minded Dhritarashtra's son, who have gathered here to fight this war. Arjuna's self-confidence and bravado rose to fever pitch. His words indicated disgust for Duryodhana, and everyone associated with him, including Dhritarashtra, who was Arjuna's uncle and a senior figure in the family. Arjuna seemed to say, "My victory is guaranteed, my prowess is superior, so let me look at the people that I am going to kill in battle today." He probably also wanted his opponents to take a closer look at him, so that the sight of Arjuna in full warrior mode would further weaken their spirits. Like Duryodhana's comment from a few verses ago, "Our army is unlimited and theirs is not," this comment indicated that Arjuna's ego was as puffed up as Duryodhana's. Little did Arjuna know that Sri Krishna was going to totally change his state of mind very, very soon. Bhagavad Gita verse 24-25, chapter 1. Sanjay said, "O descendant of Bharat, having heard Gudakesha address him, Hrishikesh positioned his magnificent chariot between the 2 armies. In front of Bhishma, Drona, and the other kings, he said, 'O Partha, behold all the Kuru warriors gathered here.'" Sri Krishna obeyed Arjuna's instructions, like any devoted charioteer should, and positioned their chariot in the middle of the Kaurava and Pandava armies. But he chose an interesting location. He positioned it right where Arjuna could see his fondest relatives, friends, and well-wishers on the Kaurava side. So now, Arjuna was face to face with the people he had love and respect for, including Bhishma and Drona. This verse contains the first words spoke by Sri Krishna in the Gita, and reflect his wise and clever personality. Instead of referring to the Kauravas as sons of Dhritarashtra as Arjuna and Sanjaya did, he refers to them as Kurus. This was an interesting choice, because both Kauravas and Pandavas are part of the Kuru dynasty. So Sri Krishna was pointing out the similarity between the two armies rather than their differences. In addition, Sri Krishna wanted to use this opportunity to create the conditions in which he would deliver the teaching of the Gita. He knew that Arjuna's puffed-up ego and battle spirit would be challenged by bringing him face to face with warriors like Bhishma and Drona, who were not just mighty and powerful, but were also people he cared a lot about. Bhagavad Gita verse 26, chapter 1. There, Arjuna sought his fatherly and grandfatherly elders, teachers, uncles, brothers, sons, grandsons, as well as friends, in-laws and well-wishers, present in both armies. Before Sri Krishna had spoken, the Kaurava army seemed like one big sea of evil to Arjuna, ready to be destroyed. But after Arjuna heard those words, he began to spot some known faces in the Kaurava army. He saw Drona, Bhishma, and all the other people he knew. Soon, he began to see familiar faces in both the Kaurava and Pandava armies. This experience is not so far away from the real world. In fact, a similar situation could have been faced by soldiers in the India-Pakistan war, where many soldiers may have had to fight their friends and relatives. Even if we never have to wage war, we may have faced a similar situation. Imagine you are a student who is about to graduate from college. You have been shortlisted for a prestigious job that is also highly selective. There is just one student that will get recruited from your college. You prepare for this interview for several weeks. On the day of the interview, you are almost 100% sure that you will pass through the interview with flying colors. As you step into the waiting hall for the interview, you conduct a quick survey of the candidates that you will compete against. You find out that Miss X, someone who's always on top of the dean's list, and someone who you thought had already accepted another offer, is also waiting in the interview hall, looking sharp and confident. What goes through your mind? Bhagavad Gita verse 27, chapter 1. Seeing his kinsman standing near him, Arjuna, son of Kunti, became overwhelmed with pity, and struck by despair, spoke this. Strong egos are mired in duality. Like bipolar person, a strong ego can go from one emotion to its exact opposite almost instantly. When Arjuna saw the caliber of warriors in the opposing army, his demeanor switched from courage to cowardice in a matter of seconds. Why did this happen? When one is under the control of the ego rather than the rational intellect, one's emotional balance is extremely vulnerable. All it took to destabilize his balance was for Sri Krishna to highlight Arjuna's kinsman in the army. This verse also shows that no one is immune from the workings of the ego. Arjuna was a well-educated, committed warrior, in fact one of the best warriors on the planet. Even someone as tough as him lost his emotional balance so quickly. Bhagavad Gita verse 28-30, chapter 1. O Krishna, I see my kinsmen gathered here to fight. My limbs are weakening, and my mouth has completely dried up, my body is quivering and my hair is standing on end. My Gandiva bow is slipping from my hands, my skin is burning, I am unable to stand and cannot think clearly. After his mind was thrown off balance, Arjuna experienced a full-scale panic attack. In these verses, Arjuna described his symptoms to Sri Krishna, beginning first with his physical symptoms and in later verses, his mental and emotional symptoms. It is rare that one gets to see a blow-by-blow account of a nervous breakdown in a spiritual text. But as we have seen, the Gita is not just a spiritual text but also an extremely practical text. The rest of the chapter will look at what statements Arjuna or any individual will make when undergoing a highly disturbed emotional state. Many commentaries do not give importance to these verses. However, I think they are instructive for a variety of reasons, the primary one being that when we undergo such disturbed emotional states, we lose the objectivity to see clearly what is happening to us and perhaps stay alert for such symptoms. Bhagavad Gita verse 31, chapter 1. O Keshava, I see omens that are inauspicious. I also do not see the good in killing my kinsmen in battle. When one's emotions are running unchecked, rationality goes out the window. That's when one starts talking or thinking about irrational things like superstition, which is what Arjuna was alluding to in this verse. On the surface, one would attribute Arjuna's second statement in this verse to an outpouring of compassion towards his kinsman. But, would an outpouring of compassion cause a panic attack? The true underlying emotion that caused the panic attack was fear. And what was Arjuna afraid of? Arjuna was accustomed to winning every war that he fought. When he saw the caliber of warriors in the Kaurava army, his ego felt extremely threatened that maybe this time it won't win. Here we see that Arjuna's ego was trying to deflect this fear by substituting compassion for the true emotion of fear. Bhagavad Gita verse 32, chapter 1. O Krishna, neither do I desire victory, nor pleasures, nor the kingdom. Of what value is the kingdom, pleasure, or in life itself, O Govinda? A search for common symptoms of depression on the web turns up the following information. 1. Feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. A bleak outlook, nothing will ever get better and there's nothing you can do to improve your situation. 2. Loss of interest in daily activities. No interest in former hobbies, pastimes, or social activities. You've lost your ability to feel joy and pleasure. 3. Appetite or weight changes. Significant weight loss or weight gain, a change of more than 5% of body weight in a month. 4. Sleep changes. Either insomnia, especially waking in the early hours of the morning, or oversleeping, also known as hypersomnia. 5. Anger or irritability. Feeling agitated, restless, or even violent. Your tolerance level is low, your temper short, and everything and everyone gets on your nerves. 6. Loss of energy. Feeling fatigued, sluggish, and physically drained. Your whole body may feel heavy, and even small tasks are exhausting or take longer to complete. 7. Self-loathing. Strong feelings of worthlessness or guilt. You harshly criticize yourself for perceived faults and mistakes. 8. Reckless behavior. You engage in escapist behavior such as substance abuse, compulsive gambling, reckless driving, or dangerous sports. 9. Concentration problems. Trouble focusing, making decisions, or remembering things. 10. Unexplained aches and pains. An increase in physical complaints such as headaches, back pain, aching muscles, and stomach pain. Arjuna was suffering from most of the symptoms from this list. He now was mired in deep, almost suicidal depression, especially because he was questioning the value of life itself. Bhagavad Gita verse 33, chapter 1. Those, for whose sake we seek kingdom, enjoyment and happiness, are present here in war, ready to give up their desire for life and wealth. Here Arjuna continues his fall into delusion by justifying why there is no point in living, or in carrying out the mission that he had committed to carry out. In his confused state, his mind mixed up his personal relationships with his mission-wise relationships. In work, we are often asked to not take things personally. Here we see an example of what happens when someone in war inserts personal aspects of his life into his work, resulting in complete confusion and breakdown of the mission. Bhagavad Gita verse 34-35, chapter 1. Teachers, uncles, fathers, sons, as well as granduncles, maternal uncles, fathers-in-law, brothers-in-law and other relatives are here. Although they would like to kill me, I don't want to attack them, O Madhusadana. When I won't do so even if it would win me all the three worlds, what to speak of winning just this earth? We notice here that Arjuna essentially repeated his argument that he does not want to attack anyone in this war, since anyone he attacks is bound to be either a friend or a relative. But why was he repeating his arguments? Note that in each verse, he addressed Sri Krishna directly, hoping to get some sort of support or endorsement from him. But Sri Krishna did not say one word, since he wanted to wait till Arjuna's delusionary outburst ended. In the second verse about not desiring victory in the three worlds, Arjuna tried to justify his retreat from fighting by wrapping his cowardice in a cloak of fake large-heartedness. The ego can sometimes be more cunning than any politician. Bhagavad Gita verse 36, chapter 1. What pleasure will we derive by killing these relatives of Dhritarashtra, O Janardana? We will only incur sin by killing these felons. As Arjuna built up a case in favor of not fighting the war, he added another point, that this endeavor will incur sin. This is a critical point in understanding the message of the Gita. Let us examine what is meant by sin here. Since the word sin has several interpretations, let us first take something that we can define more precisely, which is the word crime. What is a crime? A crime is defined as an act conducted in opposition to a certain law enshrined in a country's legal system. So then, what is a sin? A sin is also defined as an act committed in opposition to a certain law. But what is that law? Who has written that law? Is that law defined by a certain religion? Or by certain societal traditions? Which law did Arjuna use to come to the conclusion that his was about to commit a sin? If Sri Krishna agreed that Arjuna's act was a sin, he would have said something. But as we see, Sri Krishna did not say anything even after hearing this statement. All this boils down to a simple point: when faced with a situation in life, how should we act? As the Gita unfolds, we will get to the heart of this question. Bhagavad Gita verse 37, chapter 1. Therefore, it is not appropriate for us to kill these relatives of Dhritarashtra who are also our brothers. How can we gain pleasure by killing our own, O Madhava? The word tasmat, which means therefore, indicates the conclusion of an argument. Here, Arjuna concluded his argument to Sri Krishna, in which he asserted that he did not want to fight. To defend that argument, Arjuna provided several points: that there was no point in the war or even in living itself, that the very people that he was fighting against were the same people that made him happy, that killing his kinsmen and his well-wishers was a sin, and that there would be no joy derived in doing so. This argument was not built on any sort of rationality or logic, because Arjuna came under the influence of moha or delusion, the delusion that personal relationships were more important in the battlefield than one's duty. An increase in moha usually suppresses our ability to discern between what is correct and what is not. This discerning ability is called viveka. Here's a real-world example that illustrates moha and viveka. Imagine that your brother has a drinking problem and needs to hear from you that the addiction needs to stop. What is the right thing for you to do? It is a difficult situation because your moha and viveka come into conflict. Viveka tells you that the right thing for you to do is to intervene, but moha tells you that doing so will endanger your relationship. Another common example is that a surgeon will usually not perform an operation on a relative exactly because of this moha. Bhagavad Gita verse 38-39, chapter 1. If their greed-afflicted minds cannot see the error in annihilating society, and the sin of quarreling with their friends, why shouldn't we, who correctly perceive this error, refrain from committing this sin, O Janardana? Arjuna now began a second argument in which he began enumerating the flaws of the opposing army. He wanted to point out that his moral judgment was superior relative to the opposing army's position. This current sequence of verses is a classic example of how a seemingly logical argument is completely illogical because it has sprung from erroneous foundations. Moreover, Arjuna echoes the human tendency to point out flaws in others when the flaw lies in the pointer. Illogical as it may be, Arjuna's comment lets us explore a force similar to moha, that of lobha or the desire to accumulate something. An increase in lobha for an object, person, situation or circumstance tends to suppress our viveka, our discerning ability. A politician that has extreme greed for a ministerial position could resort to illegal and unethical means to get it. Recent events in global financial markets are a good example where bankers were willing to defraud investors by selling them subprime loans, simply due to greed. Both moha and lobha have one thing in common: they seemingly result in pleasure. For example, in case of moha, extreme attachment one's son or one's spouse gives one pleasure. In case of lobha, the desire to accumulate wealth or power gives one pleasure. But in both cases, the pleasure that one obtains is temporary and fleeting. In addition, one tends to cling to the object gained by lobha or moha for fear of losing it. So what attitude should we have towards people or things we care about? The Gita delves into this topic in great detail. Bhagavad Gita verse 40, chapter 1. As society gets destroyed, its timeless laws and traditions erode. Once that happens, lawlessness begins to dominate the entire society. We are nearing the end of the first chapter, and have just begun examining the last set of verses. Here, Arjuna's deluded mind began to spin out of control, and the scale of his delusion became progressively magnified. He began enumerating how the act of warfare between the two warring factions will ultimately result in the destruction of civilization. Infighting has caused the downfall of empires and civilizations, the most notable example being the Roman Empire. When the upholders of the law, namely the statesmen and the warriors, fight among themselves, a breakdown of law and order takes place. But here, Arjuna looked only at the worst-case scenario, totally ignoring the possibility that the war could result in restoration of peace, order and prosperity to the kingdom. His mind had begun a downward slide of negativity that only became worse as he spoke more. Bhagavad Gita verse 41, chapter 1. When lawlessness dominates, it deteriorates the condition of women in society, O Krishna. Deterioration of women, O Varshniya, gives rise to contamination of character. Arjuna's rambling apocalyptic post-war imagination continues. He echoes a fear that most warriors have in the back of the mind when they go to war. Invading armies seldom show respect and dignity to the women of the defeated kingdom, they are usually treated as the spoils of the war. History has proven this out, and unfortunately, it is still the case wherever there is the aftermath of war. In any society, due to the law of averages, there always will be a part of the population with questionable morals and character. However, in a post-war situation where women are treated without dignity and have to succumb to their invaders, there is no guarantee that they will be able to raise their children with the right values, education and morals. This results in a breakdown in character in the younger generation across the board. Arjuna downward spiraling mind feared this scenario. Bhagavad Gita verse 42-43, chapter 1. Contamination of character pushes the annihilators of society and society itself into hell. Their ancestors fall from grace, having been deprived of their offerings of pinda and water. Timeless societal and humanitarian values and traditions are destroyed by the contamination of character created by these annihilators of society. In Indian culture, one's ancestors and family lineage are given great importance. In these verses, Arjuna expressed his worry that the deterioration of post-war society would result in loss of respect for the ancestors who created the laws and values of that society. It is not that difficult to draw a parallel between the reverence for the ancestors of a society expressed here, and the reverence for the builders of any institution in the modern world. During every Independence Day celebration of a country, freedom fighters' contributions are remembered and revered. Similarly, if you walk the hallways of any modern corporation, you will usually see the founders' portraits displayed prominently. Someone who cares deeply about one's country, or about one's place of work, will never look forward to the denigration of the founders. Arjuna, even in his deluded state, cared about the builders of the Kuru dynasty. Bhagavad Gita verse 44-45, chapter 1. People whose societal values have eroded, O Janardana, reside in hell indefinitely, this I have heard. Alas! It's unfortunate that we have decided to undertake this extreme sin. Our greed towards the pleasures of the kingdom has prepared us to kill our kinsmen. Here, Arjuna concluded an argument that he had begun a few verses prior. According to him, a rise in lawlessness began a chain reaction which caused the entire civilization, not just the warmongers, to end up residing in hell indefinitely. Let's summarize this argument. What Arjuna is saying, in simple words, is that the Kaurava army is committing the sin of destroying the Kuru clan. Since he can see that it is a sin, he will not join them in this act, and therefore not fight. Again, we see moha at work here. Duryodhana had moha for the Kauravas, whereas Arjuna had moha for the entire Kuru dynasty. Even though Arjuna was more large-hearted than Duryodhana in his moha clouded his judgment the same way it clouded Duryodhana's judgment. Moreover, in verse 45, Arjuna demonstrates classic victim mindset where one cannot see oneself in control of a situation, by using words such as alas, it is unfortunate. His moha took over his mind so completely that one of the world's foremost warriors spoke words that a weakling would use. Bhagavad Gita verse 46, chapter 1. Even if I, unarmed and non-resistant, am killed in war by the sons of Dhritarashtra, who are armed with weapons, this will be beneficial for me. This is the final statement uttered by Arjuna in the first chapter of the Gita. It shows the extent of delusion in Arjuna's mind, as he morphed from a mighty warrior into a pathetic, weak, helpless individual. Arjuna was desperately looking to escape the difficult situation he found himself in, and so his mind came up with all kinds of arguments to justify this escape, including making the escape beneficial. Let us revisit our friend Mr. X. He has been laid off due to the recession, and has been out of work for 3 months. He has not interviewed in over 2 weeks now. As time goes by, his confidence begins to weaken. If his mind cannot maintain equanimity, it will lead him down a path similar to Arjuna's fall. He begins to think that there's no point in applying for more jobs since there aren't any, and even if he gets an interview call, he has to compete with more qualified candidates. Therefore, there's no point even trying. In fact, it's better to stay at home and do nothing because there's no point applying for a job in a bad economy. Just look at how his mind has generated perverse logic to preserve the ego. There's another point to note here. Sri Krishna kept quiet throughout Arjuna's rant. He wanted Arjuna to expel every perverse argument out of his system, in preparation for the teaching of the Gita. Bhagavad Gita verse 47, chapter 1. Having said these words in the battlefield, Arjuna sat in the center of his chariot, casting off his weapons, his mind disturbed with sorrow. Evam, thus. Uktva, having said. Arjunaha, Arjun. Samkhya, on the battlefield. Wrath, chariot. Upastaha, center. Upavishat, sat. Visrujya, cast out. Sasharam, with arrows. Chapam, and bow. Shoka, sorrow. Samvinyam, disturbed. Manasaha, mind. Arjuna ended his rant in this verse, which is the final verse in chapter 1. His body language reflects his state of mind as he threw away his weapons and sat down on his chariot, in the midst of the battlefield. Sanjay the narrator took over here, and possibly gave a glimmer of hope to Dhritarashtra, who was hoping that this action of Arjuna could end the war even before it began. Let us reflect upon the first chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, in preparation for the second chapter. Arjuna, ready for war, under the influence of his ego and mind, became weak when Sri Krishna moved the chariot in between the Pandava and Kaurava armies. Now, we may never face a war in our lifetime, but we will undoubtedly face conflicts in life where we lose our mental equipoise, and need guidance on what the right course of action is. Death of a loved one, hard economic conditions, issues with family members or friends, a bad boss, a stressful job, life is full of conflict-ridden situations. This chapter is called Arjuna Vishada Yoga, or the Yoga of Arjuna's Dejection. We will delve deeper into the meaning of the word yoga later, but for now, let's assume that it means technique or method that shows how one should conduct oneself in a life situation. So why is Arjuna's dejection called a technique or a method? Let's take an example. Assume you own a car, and ever since you owned the car for about 10 years or so, you have never had an accident, and you never had the need to get a car insurance policy. But one fine day, you drive into your neighbor's car, and end up owing him a gigantic sum of money. From that day onwards, you will never ever drive a car without insurance. So, what this means is that you had to pass through an extremely difficult situation in order to gain the knowledge that insurance is important. Similarly, Arjuna had to pass through an extremely difficult life situation which jolted him so much that it made him realize that he was missing something essential. He did not know how to conduct himself in such a difficult situation. Fortunately for him, Sri Krishna was right there to provide him that instruction. But without passing through that tough life situation, he never would have realized the need for such an instruction. Therefore, just like any other chapter in the Gita, this chapter is also a yoga, or a method, of how to conduct one's life correctly. Summary of Bhagavad Gita Chapter 1. The message of the first chapter of the Gita is this: the root cause of all sorrow and suffering in this world is our inability to deal with conflict. That is why the Gita was taught to Arjuna in the middle of a gruesome battlefield, with swords clanging, trumpets roaring and soldiers screaming. Conflict is everywhere, and we have to learn to handle it. The sooner we recognize this universal truth about conflict and its impact, the sooner we can progress in our personal, professional, and ultimately, spiritual journeys. We experience conflict at 3 levels: material, mental, and spiritual. At the material level, conflict is everywhere. Atoms collide against atoms. Weeds take over carefully manicured flowers. Packs of wolves fight for control of territory. And we humans have disagreements with children, siblings, spouses, bosses, co-workers, states and countries. To deal with conflict at the material level, we need to learn how to act, and what to say, in any situation. Now, here's the second kind of conflict. How we conduct ourselves in material conflict is largely dependent on the state of our minds. Our minds are always in conflict, primarily between our rational side and our ego. Our primal urges constitute the ego, the part of our mind that oversimplifies and exaggerates situations, and responds to every situation with a fight or flight reaction, and shuts off the rational part of our mind that can think logically and clearly. And even when our rational mind is active, we are unable to make the right decision because we cannot resolve conflicting arguments. We are always talking to ourselves in our head. I should buy this shirt. No, wait, that shirt looks better. But this one is on sale. Back to Arjuna's dilemma. When confronting the material conflict of battle, Arjuna's rational mind was clear. He was a warrior, and he had entered the battlefield to fight a war against the enemy for a just cause. But, upon seeing his family on the enemy side, his rational mind became conflicted. Should I kill my family? Or should I perform my duty? Eventually his ego, the primitive side of his mind, took control away from his rational mind. It went into flight mode. It made him say, "It is better to run away and become a monk, than to perform my duty." The inability to reconcile this conflict in his mind led to his mental breakdown in the middle of the battlefield. He could not commit to fighting, and being unable to decide, he wanted to quit. So then, conflict at the material level, and at the mental level, is pervasive. It is an integral part of life. We cannot escape it. But so what? Shouldn't we just accept this state of affairs? What's unique about the Gita is its perspective on how we should deal these two levels of conflict. The clue lies in verses 21 and 22, where Sri Krishna positions Arjuna literally in the middle of the two armies, a point from which Arjuna can see his dearest teachers and relatives stationed on the other side of the battlefield. This immediately triggers the third type of conflict, not material, not mental, but that of identity. Arjuna now thinks, who am I? Am I the warrior fighting for a just cause? Or am I the beloved student of my teacher? If I am that warrior, I should be in the Pandava army. If I am that beloved student and relative, I should be in the Kaurava army. But I am both. I am all of these roles, and many more. So what should I do? Since I don't know how to reconcile my identity, let me quit. It is the easiest option I have. Quitting is the default response of the ego. In his speech to Sri Krishna, Arjuna used logic to justify his quitting the battle. This is what many of us do. We run away from our conflicts, and use logic, or even God or religion, a whole host of rationalizations, to justify our quitting to ourselves, and to others. Here, we use the word God to refer to the invisible random forces that drive the world, including chance, luck, destiny, fate, evolution, and so on. This confusion of identity is the third type of conflict, the spiritual conflict. Unless we know who we are, what God is, and what our connection to that God is, we will never be able to completely resolve all of our material and mental conflicts. This is the central theme of the first chapter. The second chapter contains Sri Krishna's response to Arjuna's misguided speech, and a summary of the entire Gita. It addresses how to deal with all three types of conflicts, so that we can put an end to sorrow and anxiety at their root.